right here. John puts this out a lot different than the other gospels. If you go back and put all the gospels together, because you get a little bit of everyone tells it not differently. It's there's more or less detail per each event as far as what happened in the garden. John doesn't give us the prayer that Jesus, he went and he prayed in the garden and he came back and found what? The disciples asleep. So he turned and he went again and he prayed and he come back and what? They were asleep again. So um, John doesn't give us any of that. And that's okay because you really need to put them all together to get the entire gospel. But John does give us what we need, and that is Jesus died. He was suffered before Pontius. One thing that John does give is way more detail and the communication that was between Jesus and Pontius Pilate. The other Gospels give very little, where Jesus pretty much just stood and didn't say a word. Pontius Pilate and Jesus had several conversations back and forth. John doesn't show or give the detail that Pontius Pilate sent Jesus to uh, Caesar, not Caesar. Oh goodness, he didn't. Pontius Pilate did send him farther to. It was Caesar. Uh, so there's a lot. There's many details. They're not necessarily left out. It was John was given the glorifying Jesus throughout the book of John. It was all about Jesus. Remember that Matthew gives a whole different account of Jesus' walk. Mark does it, and Mark teaches to the Romans. Matthew taught to the Jews. So each of these gospels are speaking to a different crowd. John gives just a different account. So without muddying the water anymore, we'll just get started. How about that? I did update our prayer list. What the names that we had from last week with a sheet down. I know Robbie and Brooke for sure. She's getting ready to have the new little one. And Robbie, don't forget about Robbie. You know he's living with Brooke. Remember? Y'all awake this morning? Yes, ma'am. Who's that? Where was it at? What's the last name? Spell it. I'm sorry. Hmm. Go straight to the thing. Okay. Oh, really? I'm teaching, sir. If you mind being a little more quiet when you come in. Come in, come in. Anyone else this morning? Inside. Lost control. I don't think I ever had it. Mm-hmm. Working on that 40 minutes. All right. Anyone else this morning? We got to get started. All right. Well, let's open with a word. Does anyone like to open us this morning with a word of prayer before we get started? Not everybody at once. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Jerry. All right. So we will start in John chapter 18. Most of 19, I'm not going to do a lot of stopping and explaining. 19 is the crucifixion. There's not really a lot of explaining that needs to be done. The word explains itself. And it's not that I'm making light of it, but it doesn't need it. So you'll see when we get in there. But we'll start in 18. And last week, if you remember, I read some into 18. Jesus had just finished chapter 17 of John was Jesus' prayer. First for himself, then for his disciples, and then for his church. He has just finished praying, and they leave. They go out. They are headed to the garden where Jesus prays. John leaves that out. So starting in verse 18, when Jesus had spoken these words, finishing his prayer, finished speaking these words, he went out from with his disciples over the brook Kidron. The brook Kidron was a valley. They had been through there several times. It was going up to the garden. Which he and his disciples entered. They'd been there several times. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops. Last week we talked about it, and Brett was here, and I asked him how many he thought that was. And we both said about 50. It's what we thought. After really putting a little more research into it, it could have been up to 500. It was and if you go back through the other Gospels, Matthew said a multitude of troops, which would have been several. So 50 is probably way under what it was. It was probably way more than 50. Um, let's see, jump to verse 4. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, whom are you seeking? And they answered and said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus said to him, I am he. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with him. And now when he said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Just by the power of him speaking, just his words, the ones that came to get him fell backwards away from him. And then he asked them again, whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go away. And there's a reason why he says that. He's going to tell us in a second. Verse 9, that the saying might be fulfilled, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. And in just a moment, it's going to be very important, because what does Peter do? He takes a sword and what? He cuts off an ear. And yet they did not arrest him. Has anybody ever thought about that? Peter took a sword and cut the ear off a soldier. And it wasn't just any soldier. We're going to find out in a minute. This was an important guy. And they just let everybody go. And this is because Jesus asked him there, all these will be gone. I will lose none whom the Father has given me. Good morning. We're in chapter 18 of the book of John, verse 10. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. The high priest's servant. Well, he wasn't just anybody. He was a servant of the high priest. So he actually, and they even we get his name in the book of John. The servant's name was Malchus. We're going to go with that, unless somebody has a better. We'll go with Malchus. John is the only gospel that mentions the servant's name, Malchus, and is the only gospel that says it was Peter. No other gospel, only John. Then the detachment of troops in verse 12, and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first. Now, Annas was, find out, he was pretty much the mastermind behind the entire falsifying, wanting to have Jesus killed. His son-in-law was the high priest, Caiaphas, but Annas was the one that was behind it. He went to him first. Let's see, verse 14. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews it was expedient that no man should die, that one man should die for the people. And Simon Peter, verse 15, followed Jesus, and so did another. Who was the other disciple that went with Peter? John. John was the other disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. So John had been amongst these men before. He knew these people. He was in, they knew each other. Peter, however, did not. He was a true outsider. He was a fisherman, right? And Peter had a big mouth. So Peter's standing outside trying not necessarily to fit in, but not stand out. It doesn't work out real well. That's where he gets called out. So at verse 16, but Peter stood at the door outside. Another disciple who was known by the high priest went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I am not." That's number one. First time Peter denies Jesus. First time. John gives the 3 denials of Peter, but that's it. If you go back through the other Gospels, you get a little more detail at how Peter went out and wept bitterly. We don't get any of that in the book of John. John is all about glorifying Jesus throughout especially the ending, throughout the entire book, but especially the ending. Now the servants, in verse 18, the servants and the officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Now notice it was cold, and it's very